Hello, John.
Hi, Benjamin.
Good afternoon, evening to you.
Good evening to you. Good morning to you.
Yeah. Okay, well, that works. Well, we've only got like 2 minutes, so perhaps we just hold the line and
All right.
and then kick off. If you could, actually no, probably best not to do anything. if one tinkers with it, you know, the whole thing could go down. Okay, well, I think it's 8 o'clock on one of my clocks. So good evening to you. Good morning wherever you are. This is the Emerging Future Institute. My name is Benjamin James Butler, and I'm joined by one of the preeminent futurists in the United States, John L Petersen, founder of the Arlington Institute. And John, your bio is so long, I wouldn't know where to start with it. You have a very diverse background, and I hope readers get to look on our website at that. So welcome, John.
It's nice to be with you, Benjamin.
Thank you. That leads into my first question. I mean, we've gone for the sort of unfiltered version today. We're just going to see how it flows. I think we'll get hopefully more profound insights that way. But I did plan on the first question at least, which was what do you see the role as a futurist, and maybe you could weave into that a little bit more about your background. It could be useful for us.
Yeah, sure. You know, if there wasn't that much change, then there wouldn't be the need for futurists. You wouldn't need to anticipate futures. You wouldn't need to be able to anticipate what alternatives might be, because nothing was changing. And the thing that's unique about this period of time, from my point of view, is that we're in the middle of the most profound change that the planet has ever seen and humanity has ever seen. Certainly anything that we have recorded. We're in the middle of exponential change that, from any number of perspectives, suggests that it is the end of one era and the beginning of a new one, and that this new one is going to be dramatically different than the past. Structurally different. We will be different human beings. It'll be a different world. It's really big time change, and we can talk a little bit about that if you'd like. But the fact that there is so much change going on in the world begs the requirement for people who can systematically and conceptually and otherwise understand or think about or posit what this change might be. And so I would argue, I guess, is that there's never been a better time in the history of the planet for folks to be able to kind of specialize in anticipating futures, both because of the context and the environment, but also because of the kind of technologies and the capabilities that are available. It's almost as though the organism has presented it as emerged the kind of capabilities to be able to make sense out of what in the world was going on in ways that you've never had before, because the environment and the context is different than it's ever been before. And the kind of the underlying characteristics of the requirement or the discipline, if you will, is the requirement to understand things in kind of systems terms, and to be broadly kind of knowledgeable and discussive about lots of different kind of disciplines, because it's all a big system and it's all interconnected and it's all moving ahead. And so it's moving ahead in just dramatic, profound kind of ways. And so I think being a futurist is really an important kind of thing, and to be able to do that well. And, frankly, I don't think there are many people who, even in our area of expertise in our profession, Benjamin, who fully understand what's going on and where this could be going and what the fundamental kind of implications of all of this change is. There are plenty of people who call themselves futurists who are interested in the future technology and the future of politics or whatever, economics. But very few see it in big, broad kind of terms. And in order to make sense out of what's going on here, I think you have to see it in broad terms. That requires, among other things, is to have some kind of an understanding of technology and science. I would say I have young people come to me kind of fairly regularly saying, what should I do? How do I get in the business? And what I suggest to them is that if you don't have some kind of an understanding of technology and the science kind of underpinnings that allow you to understand that technology, you won't really understand what's happening here, because it's so much driven by technology. But anyway, I think futurism and being a futurist can be extraordinarily valuable. And if you would like, we can talk a little bit about how that might happen.
What might happen, John?
Well, how you might how being a futurist and what you might do, and how you might apply some of those skills.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Well, I think as you know, and some of your listeners or your viewers might know from looking at my background, is that I think that being able to looking at making some kind of sense about what's happening in this world requires an unusual perspective, an unconventional perspective, if you will. Again, if the change was not too great, you could do extrapolation, you could kind of do trend analysis and some other kind of things, and you could kind of shoehorn yourself into some ideas about what might be out on the horizon that might get you kind of close to that. But when you get exponential change, when you get large scale breakthroughs piled on top of breakthroughs on top of breakthroughs, then everything you brought into the room with you, all of the experience you've got, the luggage that you've come from, the education that you had, tells you nothing about what is going to happen, and certainly doesn't tell you anything about the interconnections and the interdependencies, interactions of all of these things that are coming downstream. And so a lot of the conventional approaches to thinking about the future, or many of the conventional approaches, don't work very well when you have high rates of change. I wrote a little book called Out of the Blue, Wildcards, and it's about wildcards, big surprise events that could rapidly kind of drive the world into a new kind of direction. And I came up with 85 different things that could make major kind of change that by definition were too big or were coming too fast to be able to effectively respond to them. That is one of the characteristics of this period of time, and why it doesn't lend itself to kind of conventional kind of analysis, and particularly kind of the linear projections, because by definition it's structurally nonlinear. Yeah. And so for me, at least, to make some sense out of this, it forced me into a space of trying to find out what other sources there might be that had a different perspective from a different kind of vantage point that could be able to suggest where this was all going, and that is effectively weren't in the middle of all of the process and consumed by and dominated by the past and the constraints of kind of human perception. And so I think of that as being unconventional. I think on one hand, you have to have an understanding of conventional things, economics and energy and politics and agriculture and any number of other kind of things. But I also think that you need to, if you're going to make sense out of this world, that you've got to get outside of that, and you need to have input that starts to suggest from a higher, broader, outside kind of perspective, if you will, what might be coming downstream. Now, I kind of fell into that because I used to spend a lot of time at very senior levels in our government, and particularly in the Defense Department and national security area. And I found out about a group of people that our government had sponsored that was a very highly classified group. That was a program called Stargate. And what they did is they used psychics. They used psychics to spy on the Soviet Union and the Chinese and so on. And that, of course, is a fairly sensitive and controversial kind of approach.
Yep.
But I know from knowing very well the people who formed that program and the folks who were the operatives within the program that it was very, very highly successful, and that they systematized, they routinized the process and got to the place where they could literally, in their mind, sitting in a chair in suburban Washington, D.C., go across the world in an afternoon, get inside of a nuclear weapon that the Chinese had. I have a friend who did this. Be able to see the inner workings of that nuclear weapon and the arming system. Be able to come back mentally and draw a picture of that arming system. Literally go down to an electronics store and buy the parts and put something together and show it to the scientists who were the analysts, and they said, God, you're right. That's exactly how it could work. And they then gave him the biggest medal that we give to people in that business because of the fact that he was able to do that. That was a paradigm shift for me. I'm an electrical engineer by education. Came into this business in a very kind of linear way as a product of that kind of education, and it kind of blew my mind that there were things like that possible and things like that were happening. And as I looked into it more and more, what I found was that there are multiple sources, including people that call themselves psychics like this, but also channelers and intuitives and so on, who have very interesting and substantive, incredible kind of pictures about the large kind of sweep of what's going on right now and where we're going, and can give you some idea of the general direction of where this might be going, subject all the time to the decisions that humans make and how we drive it in different directions and not. But it's kind of like needing to look inside of a dark room that's got a locked door and you're on the outside, and having no other way to look inside. And if you could find a remote viewer or a psychic that can look inside for you and tell you what's probably inside or might be inside, you could easily make the case, or at least I can make the case, that that's a whole lot better than not having anything to say or to see or to understand. And so the way I approach this from a kind of a methodological point of view is to look at all of the conventional kind of things and try to understand very broadly about where those trends are going and what's happening and where the breakthroughs are and so on. And at the same time, kind of reach outside for these larger unconventional kind of perspectives and weave the two of them together into a larger understanding about where this whole new human that is evolving, what that looks like and what it might be. And at the same time, get some sense about the new world that's emerging.
Very interesting. I mean, I personally, I don't actually write about it too often, but I did recently write about an experience I had. I mean, what happens with me is, like everyone, I have these intuitive moments, and then normally I only write or talk about it if I find some empirical evidence to sort of back it up, and I think that's where you're coming from as well. But it was a couple of months after Obama was the beginning of his first term, and I woke up from a dream or something, and I felt absolutely convinced that at the end of Obama's second term there would be a constitutional crisis, completely out of the blue. And of course I mentioned it to a couple of close friends and clients who were close to me, but it was when I started to see the trends, various trends in American society, the polarization of views and all the rest of it, when I started actually to take it even more seriously and started to write about it. From my perspective, it can easily be interpreted as a little bit voodoo, but I think it can be, as you say, very practical. And this is just an 8-year time frame. You're talking about much vaster time frames.
Well, what you're doing and what you're talking about in kind of the methodological terms is establishing a scenario, standing up in an organized kind of picture of an alternative future that then becomes a framework for evaluating what's happening on a day-to-day basis. If you have no scenarios or no ideas in your mind about where this is going, then the things that happen on day-to-day basis make no difference. They make no sense to you. They don't fit into a possible picture in any particular way. And so it's very important, it seems to me, whether you approach it in a conventional scenario planning way or whether you do it through augment it through some of these unconventional kind of sources to begin to get some kind of an idea about what might be on the horizon. What are the possibilities? What are the options? So that you can kind of narrow this down from anything happening to a manageable number of reasonable kind of possibilities.
Mm-hmm. So, John, I want to really go into the big picture. You've I guess you kicked off the call in a pretty high-powered way, talking about the evolution of our species. But before we get to that, I was just going to ask you about sort of perhaps more mundane, but perhaps it's leading us. Perhaps it's the change or the catalyst into this evolution. But I was wondering, just to tap your mind about current events around the world. For many, 2016, if I look at people's Facebook walls, according to many, it was the worst year of their lives. It was a disaster, with Britain supposedly pulling out of the EU, and then Donald Trump winning the election in the United States. What's your interpretation of last year?
Well, it's a little different, I think, than a lot of conventional kind of perspectives. I am surrounded, as you might imagine, by a lot of folks who, in the personal development, kind of liberal, progressive, even kind of woo-woo world, all of whom profess to want change. They want a new world. They want to get rid of the kind of the problems that are the derivatives of the structure of the space that we live in right now. And the only way you do that is by changing the system. You can't work this around the edges. You can't make marginal change. It has to be kind of structural. And so whether you're a Democrat or a progressive or whatever you call yourself, they've all wanted to have some kind of major kind of change. The problem with that is that the approach to that kind of change, by definition, comes from and is influenced by and constrained by the kind of, as I suggested, the tools and the mindset and the paradigm that you bring with you. And so what they've all tried to do is fix the present system. And the present system, in my opinion, is unfixable. It is structurally flawed. It is impossible that it get fixed. In fact, if you look internally, what you can see is that the structures are increasingly failing and the system is imploding. It is not sustainable at all. And so the alternative is that you have to kind of jumpstart yourself into a new world. You have got to somehow extract yourself from the old world enough so that you can become part of building a new world. Now, I have proposed for 15 years, as I run around the world giving talks, that the old world was imploding, that it was going to get to a place where it would come apart enough that there would be a vacuum that would emerge. People would look around and say, hey, this thing is not sustainable. What is an alternative for us? And that would be the space that would allow the emergence of a new world. And that new world, if you look at historical paradigm shifts of the kind that we're looking at right now and experiencing right now, would be dramatic, extraordinary, and which is how a new world would emerge. Now, within that context, if you think of it in those kinds of terms, then you cannot get change without change, right? You don't get large-scale reorganization of the system without some equally dramatic kind of input and shift that drives the system into another operating state. There are great numbers of people with amazing kinds of resources who are trying to keep this on the same track that it's been on for years, and that has got to be shaken up in some kind of way. And I've always kind of felt that there was going to be some exogenous catalytic event of some great thing, some that shakes the system such that it would allow the emergence of this new world. Now, I think Donald Trump is the beginning of that. I think Donald Trump, and for whatever reason, and there are a lot of kind of maybe obvious reasons that analysts and other folks have come up with, but let me tell you, I don't think that we live in a world that doesn't have direction and that isn't populated by intelligences that operate in other dimensions. And I don't think this is the only planet and the first planet in the universe that has gone through this kind of a process that we're going through. And so I think that there's larger levels of kind of input and intelligence and influence and shaping and influence that are driving this one way or another and giving us as human beings the options of making decisions that will allow us to go toward this new world or away from the new world. And so what I think is that Donald Trump is the beginning of that process. Now, and he's obviously breaking a lot of china and banging himself around the White House and our world on this side of the planet. And it will be very interesting to see how that works out. What's encouraging on one hand is that no matter what he does, he is playing this catalytic and fragmenting role of the old system and allowing the emergence of the new system. Now, I told you I've got a bunch of friends who are all interested in change, but as it turns out, they don't want this kind of change, and they're just scared to death that everything's going into the toilet in a hurry. And I'm not of that opinion. I certainly, I've met Donald Trump in the past, and I wasn't particularly impressed with him then, and I wouldn't probably look for him to be a friend of mine right now. But that said, there are a lot of politicians I've run into that kind of fall into that category. And so I think what you can't do here is look at this in terms of who he is and what his personality is and what his background is, or any of the kind of conventional ways in which most people make judgments about individuals. What you have to do is look at this in terms of, as you say, if you've got an image in your mind, if you've got a scenario, if you've got a possible world that's on the horizon that's going to take us to a whole new era in terms of life on this planet, and then you can look at this guy and say, man, you can't get there from here without something like this happening. And by the way, I'm here to tell you, you don't even know what April's going to look like in terms of what might happen in Washington with Donald Trump and the Democrats and the mainstream media and everything else carrying on the way they're going on right now. And so this is not this is not somebody that you can handicap in conventional kind of terms, nor predict what's necessarily going to happen, except that it's going to be highly disruptive, and that being highly disruptive is the mechanism, is the process that will allow the emergence of a new world, I think. And so maybe he is the catalyst. Maybe he's the stepping stone. Maybe he's the interim kind of position on the way to something further downstream. But if Hillary Clinton had gotten elected, we can all be assured that there would certainly not be this kind of disruption, and there would be more than likely more of the status quo and look and things as they have been in the past.
Yeah. It's funny you use the word bull in a china shop, because that's what I wrote a few months ago. Perhaps the American electorate isn't so dumb after all. Perhaps many of the people that voted for Trump intuitively, well, they recognized Trump's narcissism and all the rest of it, but intuitively they kind of just felt something needs to change, and maybe we need a bull in a china shop. Some people described that moment last year in the UK and the US as a sort of primal scream for change.
Well, there are a great number of people, working class people and even middle class people, who just really are just very stretched and have not participated at all in the expansion of the economy. And it's very acute and very, I mean, I live in West Virginia, which is one of the poorest states in the country, and when you look at what's happening down in the coal fields and those kinds of folks, I mean, that's really great poverty, and it's not getting any better. And so this man directly appealed to those folks, and he did that very intelligently, by the way. He had a company called Cambridge Analytics working for him, who figured out in the most sophisticated ways on the planet how to analyze from particularly Facebook postings and Facebook data, big data, huge amounts of data, exactly who people are, with a granularity down to almost individuals, and be able to categorize them, if I remember right, in 12 or 16 different kind of categories, and be able to then tell you with very high fidelity what the message is that I should say to you, Benjamin, that would resonate particularly with you. And so there were the mainline press were dumping all over Donald Trump because he'd give these speeches, and it was kind of all over the place in terms of the metaphors and the way he would talk, and it didn't seem to have any kind of coherence. And the fact of the matter is that it was directly speaking to each one of those segments who were his segments in the key states, and it was an extraordinary and masterful kind of process that happened, which at one hand is kind of impressive, and on the other hand makes you wonder what in the world comes next when people hire this company to do whatever else they want them to do.
Yeah, that's what I was saying at the time, that when the media was hyperventilating about what he was saying, I was suggesting perhaps they're not talking to the media. Perhaps no. Trump was not addressing the media. He was actually addressing another demographic, which I don't think they really got.
Yeah, he didn't buy much, relatively speaking, hardly any kind of the conventional media, didn't buy a lot of television time and so on. And Hillary Clinton pursued a rather conventional kind of approach, and he just he just came in under the table and beat him. I mean, I don't know how smart this guy is. There are some people who say he's really bright and so on, but I do know that at least when this new group came in to run his election after the Republican convention, they just pointed this thing in a whole different direction, and it was very sophisticated after the fact.
Yeah, I don't want to put Trump on a pedestal at all. I kind of agree with what you said at the beginning, that he's a change agent. But one thing I read in the Washington Post's book on Trump, I think it's called Trump Revealed, which it's, you know, they put in as all this sort of negative stuff about him. But one thing that was interesting that came up for me was this. There was a moment where he said he realized that to be really smart, he had to be really dumb. And he was kind of pointing to using his gut feeling. And so I think, you know, a lot of people write him off because he's clearly not, at least when he talks in the public realm, he doesn't really come across as an intellectual. But perhaps because he's tapping into his intuition, that he seems to have had a bunch of success.
That's an interesting point that you raise, because I think that the more you figure out about what you think you know about this world and how it works and this reality, the less. The more you understand how little you know. I mean, I think that's essentially, if I heard you correctly, if I interpreted it correctly, what Trump was saying. And I think writ large, that is the kind of mindset, that is the approach for dealing with this paradigm shift. Because at a very fundamental level, we really don't know what's going on here, and you could make that statement in a number of different sectors. And if you just start at, say, the political level or the government level, I can tell you, I worked in the White House at the National Security Council staff, and I can tell you that what you read about in the newspaper almost never is what literally happened. That there were levels upon levels of stuff and fighting and inner things and deals being done and all kinds of stuff. And then everybody that's got a dog in the fight is trying to spin the news to make it show up to benefit them. And so by the time it gets to the Washington Post or the New York Times or Time Magazine or any of these kinds of things, they all have extraordinary, not only biases from the people who are writing about it now, more than probably in the past, but more than that, they weren't inside and they didn't have the security clearances and they didn't know. And then, and there are 5 probably or 6 different layers like that are all playing in different kind of ways. And so you got to enter this space just being very permeable, very open, and listening to all of the little indications, whether they come from intuition or wherever they come from, and try to see where do the ideas and the concepts start to cluster together to where you get corroboration and so on. Because this is not, if you decide what your policies are and how you see the world and everything based on the mainstream media, I can assure you, you are wrong. You do not know what is driving all of this. And you may feel very strongly about it, and you really think that this person is a great person and somebody else got screwed and so on, and you don't know what's going on. And so it just and that problem exacerbates as you go into this exponential kind of space where you have these energy breakthroughs and biological breakthroughs, and and consciousness breakthroughs and on, and going one after another, to say nothing about large scale things like climate change and so on. I mean, you have just got to, I think, be very, hubris doesn't work in that space.
Yeah.
I think that you just got to really say, wait a second here. We're kind of scrambling around in the dark here, trying to figure out what's what, and I'm trying to, walk in the dark across rocks in the middle of a rushing stream, and if I fall off, I mean, I can't see. It's just the hazards and the reality is just really, really hard to know. And so I think that opens you up to the new ideas that begin to describe not only the way forward, but also the possibilities for the new world. Because the new world, if this is anything like every other past transition like this, the new world is fundamentally indescribable from the present position, from the present location. That our world is defined by the rules and the principles and the ideas and the other kind of things that describe this paradigm. And so if you are trying to look 20 or 30 years downstream, where you're into a mini ice age or something, and there's been some extraordinary consciousness shift, and the governments have failed, and you don't need money anymore in the same way you do, and and people lived 140 or 100, 200 years or whatever, all of these, and the list of possibilities, realistic possibilities, are really quite long. Then you just really have to really back away from that and say, wait a second, that's going to operate in space in ways that I don't understand it, and by the interconnections and the community, and by the way, you're into a space, presuming the internet advances in the same way that it is right now, you're into a space where you almost have a global you have a global brain, a global nervous system and so it just doesn't operate. The metabolism is faster. Everything is way, way different. I mean, if part of this, and there's lots of indications that say this might be possible, but then within 20 years you find out that there's significant life off of this planet from other places that have been visiting us for a long time. I mean, wow, it just drives, all of the underpinnings about how you thought about things and how you understood things are all kind of go out the window, and you have to rebuild it. You have to build things in a whole new way. And you can't do that if you're locked into a mind position that's in the old world. You've got to be, very flexible. You have to be very highly adaptable. You have to be very open and permeable. You just have got to be able to surf into that space with a very open mind.
Apart from the psychological approach, which I totally agree with, what's pragmatically speaking, what can we do to prepare for this new future?
Well, I think in really kind of fundamental practical terms, you need some level of resilience, because and you need resilience on a couple of different levels. You need kind of physical and the kind of resilience. So you need food, and you need water, and you need electricity and things like that, because our systems, our supply systems, are heavily biased toward and structured around just-in-time kind of delivery. And if things don't work quite the way they work, then you get cascading effects down through the system. And so if you have economic disruption, or you have energetic disruption, or any number of things, that you have the real possibility of shortages and problems, and that's exacerbated by the likelihood of a mini ice age. I think that's what we're on our way to. I think that within about 3 years, it's going to be very, very clear. Right now, it's far colder and far more snow and things around the planet in many places than it's been in 150 years. And the trend is in that direction. And more scientists, I think, out of this Trump administration, you're going to get a whole lot more alternative points of view from scientists who haven't had a chance to say anything, but have been suppressed in the past. But the point is that that kind of fundamental contextual change influences everything. It changes energy, it changes agriculture, it changes, the kind of the productivity. All kinds of things shift with all of that. And if you get, aliens show up, or you get any number of other kind of things, if you get a coronal mass ejection out of the sun that, fries things. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities and things, and you just, you can't get there from here without by looking at that in kind of conventional terms.
So you think citizens really need to take some self-responsibility at this stage of the game, because then the government might not be able to look after you, and probably won't.
Yeah, there's a couple things there I should mention, and one of them is the physical kind of security and resilience, but you also have to have kind of psychological resilience and social resilience. Let me suggest that if you are not in a mindset that can adapt to all of this, then it's going to be very, very hard. And so that you need to get into this space that says there's big change going on. It's not going to be the same. That we are going to understand ourselves. We're going to understand this world and how it works in far different ways than the past. And you can't get locked up into your religious or your political or your whatever kind of views in the past, because those are going to be shaken. And at the same time, in any kind of disruption like this, what you find out is social cohesion and local kind of social groups are the way that you make it through here. And so in the little town that I live in here in West Virginia, we have a number of groups that have gotten together to try to figure out how are we going to get food, and how are we going to take care of ourselves, and how are we going to do alternative energy and some other kind of things like that. And what it provides is a lot of not only alternative ideas, but a lot of kind of social and personal support as people go through different kind of aspects of all of this change. And so what you really need is the kind of the support systems, whether they're social and whether they're internal and whether they're just physical, to be able to surf into this new space. And by the way, what probably is important as anything, and it's very, very key to me, is you've got to have some idea about where this might be going. If you don't have an image, a vision, a possibility, a scenario about where this all could be going, then almost inevitably you lose hope, because everything is happening all over the place and stuff is breaking up and things aren't working the way they used to be, and you don't see cohesion in terms of the new things that are coming together, and it would be very hard to maintain hope. And so what we need to do, I think one of the most important things that guys like you and I and a few others who are trying to work this space, is what we've got to do is come up with a vision for a new world. We have to come up with a coherent kind of the beginning of a coherent kind of image of what might be on the horizon that large numbers of people can look at and say, yeah, that could be possible, and we could get from here to there, and I could see how I could contribute to that, and I can and more importantly, I can see what's going on in the world and how it's contributing and driving us toward that positive possibility. And so kind of in futurist, in mechanistic procedural kind of deliverables that come from people that like ourselves who call themselves futurists, I think that's more important than almost anything, is to start to build the kind of maybe the sequences of potential futures about where this could be going in positive terms, because it's real easy to do dystopian things there, and that's not going to get anybody into a new world. And by the way, there's a whole lot of people who are not going to. For any number of reasons, are not going to attach themselves to some of these new ideas, and they're going to go off and have their own problems and get their guns and deal with it the way they are dealing. But if you want to be part of defining and describing and populating and in being the architects of this new emergent world, then you got to start thinking of it in those kinds of terms and quit worrying about the old one, because you can't fix it. It's going to come apart. It's inevitable. And let's start to put our efforts into building an image for a new world, a concept, some internal architectures about what the principles are and what the values and how it kind of works. And you can overlay that with breakthroughs that you see coming downstream in terms of energy and other kinds of things. And you could come up with some really interesting things. And that's part of what we're trying to do here at the Arlington Institute, where I hang my hat.
I think the human ability to go through suffering and massive change is the capacity is immense if there's hope. And I think what you're saying is that people like us really need to, because I find it's very easy to get caught in the zigs and the zags of these trends, and you can get on Facebook a little bit too much and think, oh my God, people are misinterpreting this, or physically sometimes you look at social media, and I find the energy is very very troubling. I now go trekking in the mountains pretty much every day just to find that inner peace, because I feel compelled to be looking at the news, but again, at the same time, it can get you can get sort of sucked into it, and I feel that we really need to sort of point to that horizon, and the boat might be crossing a vast Atlantic or Pacific Ocean and going up and bobbing up and down, and we need to be pointing to that horizon and sort of painting an optimistic one, and then I think we'll get there.
No, I agree. I agree with you completely.
What else might be? We're sort of down to the last 10 minutes, but in terms of technologies or fast change, what else might surprise viewers, do you think?
Well, let me just mention one thing, and then we could talk about that a bit. I think there's also an issue of consciousness here, and you kind of are alluding to it, that this emergence of a new human being, and by the way, they're finding young people on the planet that have 3 and 4 strands of DNA, where most all of the rest of us only have 2 strands of DNA, and so there's literally biologically a new human that's emerging. And that new human is going to have any number of, if the DNA is different and so on, it's easy to make the case that they'll have different capabilities and essentially be engineered to be able to deal with the increasingly complex world. But there's another kind of, you asked me about how you kind of can prepare yourself and to effectively deal with all of this change. And one of the issues has to do with energy, and it has to do with consciousness, and it has to do with your mindset. Because if you read the newspapers and you get on the television and you do that every day, all of those things are driving you down, and it changes your energy and runs your energy down. And what that does is becomes self-fulfilling. That where you are, that state, that mindset that you have, that energetic level, it frankly becomes manifesting. It's a process that it produces a world that is concurrent and consistent with that perspective and that feeling. This is a lot have to do with how you feel and what your emotions are.
Yeah.
And so one of the really extraordinarily important keys to getting through all of this thing is to get into the mindset to where things are kind of happy, where you're happy and that you realize that this is gonna work, and you're gonna get there, and you can deal with this one way or another, regardless of what happens. Because what that does is it just biases the whole system up toward solutions and possibilities and ideas and other kinds of things that can get you through all of this. And so I think that, and by the way, it has physiological effects and all kinds of stuff. You're healthier. You feel, you obviously feel better. And so there's almost if we can learn how to get into that space and to kind of operate in that space, then it gives you the basis, the operating platform from which to effectively deal with all of this change. And I think that that's really critical. And
yeah.
What else?
Well, no, I absolutely concur with that. I mean, I've spent the last 10 years learning a Zen practice to keep my mind clear and actually draw my energy down into what the Chinese call the dantian, the abdomen, which is the sort of the center of your energy. And I've noticed when I drink too much coffee and I think too much, the energy rises up into the head, and that's when you think and think. But a lot of the interest in a lot of the martial arts, a lot of the Eastern practices sort of cultivate bringing that energy back to your center.
Right.
So I found that very useful, and I'm sort of doubling down on those practices at the moment. I think it's interesting though, the timing of all of this. Many great scientists at the moment are saying it's all coming to a head in this era that we're facing massive crises. Like Stephen Hawking, a month or two ago wrote a piece. At the same time that humanity's understanding of the mind and consciousness is rising very quickly. It's almost as if the Earth, it may be along the lines of Gaia theory, that it's almost by design that we're facing this existential challenges, but we've been given the tools as well, just at the right timing.
Yeah. Well, the Indians in the Vedic traditions, of course, suggest that there are these big periods of time of 26,000 years that are the yugas, and that those yugas are defined by the eccentricity of the kind of travel of the solar system relative to the offset center of the galaxy, and because of that, there's an elliptical kind of trajectory that you go, an orbit that you go on, and as you swing around and head toward the closer kind of proximity to the they suggest that there are two different major organizing forces in the center of the galaxy, and so that's what makes this eccentric or elliptical kind of orbit. But anyway, as you head yourself in, then that's where all this energetic and this innovation and all of these kinds of things start to happen, and you are on your way, some sources say, to 5,000 years of peace. And this is extraordinarily exciting. I mean, this is really quite interesting. But from a futurist point of view, it's intriguing if you would think yourself out and say that you are relatively established on that trajectory within 30 years toward 5,000 years of peace. What in the world has to happen between now and then that changes from where we are now to that kind of world? And you just know it's got to be some amazingly interesting but very profound disruption and reorganization of things that would do that. And so it's really kind of a fascinating kind of notion that this is a whole big system that's all kind of tied together, and it all changes as the energy changes and as the solar system moves into different areas in terms relative to the space and the galaxy. I mean, there's just a lot of different kind of variables, and of course the sun is going into an time of quiescence that we haven't seen for 150 years, and that's probably why it's going to get much colder here, and we're at the beginning of that.
Yeah, that's I'm kind of feeling that way. I looked into a lot of the is it the UN's IPCC? It's interesting. Quite a few scientists pulled out of that, but they were still their names were still left on the reports, even though they've resigned. And a number of them got very upset, and I think one of them's either sued them or threatened to sue them, and his name was taken off as an author. So I know we read the newspapers, and we're told that the science was settled. I remember one of Obama's guys in a Senate committee being questioned with very sensible questions, actually, from around the room, and his answer to every question was the science is settled, and he couldn't answer half the questions, and yet I keep encountering scientists that tell me they fear for a mini ice age.
Well, NASA has now come out and indicated that they think that it's really going to get cold, and so they've kind of broken step with the past. I mean, for a while there was the White House had sent an edict down to NASA and to NOAA, our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and said that they could not talk about any kind of solar influence on climate, which is kind of crazy, and now that's going to change, I think.
All right, fascinating. Do you think that's why a few of my wealthier friends have moved to hotter climates, and lots of people move into Singapore and places like that?
Could well be. I mean, there are a lot of folks who are digging holes and buying food and doing all kinds of things.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to say to our listeners.
Let me just suggest that if your viewers are interested in these kinds of things, that I publish and edit a newsletter called Future Edition, and it's free, and it comes out twice a month. And it kind of looks across the whole horizon at lots of different areas about it, things of interest. And they could find it at Future Edition. That's one E in the middle, FUTUREDITION, futureedition.org. And we'd be happy to put them on our list.
Great, great. We'll flag that on our website somewhere as well, John.
Thank you. Thanks, Benjamin.
Amazing work, and listeners, obviously, please keep coming back to emergingfuture.com and sign up for our free updates and newsletters. Love to talk to you again, John, and hopefully we can collaborate in some way in trying to paint that rosy picture for people.
I'd like to do that. That would be great.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I guess you're off to get some dinner or something.
I am.
Great. All right. Well,
all right. See you.
Thanks again. All right.
See you, Benjamin.